France, 1917. It was the third brutal year of World War I. Over 1 million French lives lost. The trenches were soaked in blood, and hope was wearing thin. Then on June 13th, as gunfire echoed across the front lines, a ship pulled into the port of Boulogne. On board was a man who many believed could turn the tide of the war, General John J. Pershing. He stepped off the ship, barrel-chested, mustached, sharp-eyed, greeted by cheering crowds desperate for a savior. To the French, Pershing symbolized American strength, a promise of salvation from the endless nightmare of war. But that hope would have to wait. You're welcome to History Empire Center. Before we proceed, please like and subscribe to our channel. Pershing wasn't about to rush into battle. The American troops with him were barely soldiers, raw, untrained, untested. Instead, Pershing set out to build something much bigger, a real army. Over the next year, he would shape a scattered force of recruits into one of the most powerful and disciplined armies the world had ever seen. An army that would help end the war and forge the future of American military might. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, John Pershing observed from across the expansive Atlantic Ocean. As the Allies, comprising Britain, France, and Russia, engaged in combat against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the United States maintained a stance of neutrality, viewing the conflict as a matter solely concerning Europe. However, the situation changed 3 years later when German submarines attacked and sank 4 unarmed American vessels, prompting President Woodrow Wilson to acknowledge that the U.S. could no longer remain uninvolved. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. President Wilson appointed Major General John Pershing, age 56, to lead the American military forces. At that time, Pershing was the only officer with significant experience in commanding large military units, having previously led an expeditionary force into Mexico in 1916 to pursue Pancho Villa. Despite this, the U.S. troops under his command in Mexico were essentially a reinforced police unit, numbering fewer than 15,000 personnel. These soldiers primarily operated on horseback and utilized relatively basic weaponry, such as rifles and bayonets. In contrast, World War I introduced a radically different type of warfare, characterized by its unprecedented scale and intensity. A total of 16 nations mobilized nearly 65 million soldiers for a conflict that spanned 3 continents. The war saw the deployment of new combat technologies, including poison gas, machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks, and aircraft, all of which proved devastatingly effective. The casualty figures from World War I are staggering. For instance, the British suffered the loss of 20,000 men in a single day. Such statistics are truly astonishing. The French losses at Verdun were similarly catastrophic, with the battle becoming emblematic of the war's brutal nature. After 3 years of relentless fighting, the conflict had devolved into a bloody stalemate. Countless soldiers sacrificed their lives to gain mere yards of territory. A continuous stretch of barbed wire extended from Switzerland in the south to the English Channel in the north, encompassing 350 miles of barbed wire, trenches, and machine guns. They found themselves ensnared in a brutal war of attrition, focused on inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy while gradually wearing them down. When General Pershing arrived in France in June 1917, he believed he had a more effective strategy for the war. He recognized that to secure victory, it was essential to move beyond trench warfare into what he termed open warfare, driving the Germans out of their trenches and engaging them in the open field, rather than merely pushing them back from one trench line to the next. He advocated for offensive tactics aimed at achieving breakthroughs. However, both the French and British had sought breakthroughs for 3 years without success, leading them to question how Pershing believed he could accomplish this. Throughout the summer of 1917, the Allies grew increasingly worried that Pershing was ill-prepared for the European conflict. The newly implemented draft would increase U.S. forces from 200,000 to 4 million men, providing much-needed reinforcements in Europe. Yet it soon became clear that Pershing lacked the necessary supplies and logistical support to sustain such a force. As one British commentator noted, America was like a giant armed with a penknife, lacking sufficient guns, artillery, and even helmets. This situation fostered a sense of frustration among the British and French, who felt that the Americans were expected to come to their aid despite being unprepared for combat. They believed that the fastest way to integrate American forces into the fight would be through a strategy known as amalgamation, which involved incorporating American troops into Allied armies that had been severely depleted of personnel. The British and French believed that what they needed was manpower, urging for all available soldiers to be sent to them. They had already established their logistical frameworks and had personnel in place, allowing for the straightforward integration of American troops. However, they were taken aback when General Pershing declared that the American forces would operate as an independent army. He insisted that American soldiers would not be deployed in a fragmented manner. Instead, they would train and develop cohesively as a unified American army. Only when they were fully prepared would they engage in combat as a single entity. On the surface, Pershing's resistance to integration was based on practical considerations. Many American soldiers were of Irish descent. How would they feel donning British uniforms? Additionally, very few Americans were proficient in French. Thus, placing an American soldier, like Private Joe Smidlop, in a French uniform within the French army would leave him confused and disoriented. Moreover, Pershing aimed to maintain the distinct identity of the U.S. Army to showcase America's strength on the global stage. He was resolute in refusing to allow European powers to fragment the American forces for use as replacements. Such an arrangement would undermine the visibility of the United States contributions, reducing them to mere footnotes in the narratives of the French and British efforts. Nevertheless, the Allies, along with some Americans, expressed concern that Pershing's commitment to forming an independent army could jeopardize the war effort. Despite the increasing pressure to accept integration, Pershing remained steadfast. His resilience during 1917 and 1918 in France stemmed from his experience of standing firm against prevailing opposition. He is quite accustomed to being the sole individual on one side of a debate. This has been a hallmark of his military career, and the current situation is merely a continuation of that pattern. Pershing's military journey commenced at West Point, where he quickly made a name for himself as a leader. Upon graduating in 1886, the ambitious Pershing actively pursued various assignments that would enhance his career. He demonstrated his leadership abilities during the Indian Wars on the frontier, participated in the Spanish-American War, where he maintained remarkable composure under fire, and gained fame for his command of American troops in the Philippines. His drive stemmed from his own character. I believe he was diligent and resolute. In fact, determined may be one of the most fitting descriptors for John Pershing. He aspired to achieve greatness. In the Library of Congress, I discovered a small booklet among his papers that could easily fit in a jacket pocket. Upon reading it, I found it reminiscent of the booklet carried by F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby, which outlined the path to success. Pershing had a keen interest in such matters. He was undoubtedly a highly ambitious individual. In 1905, Pershing married Helen Warren, the daughter of a prominent senator from Wyoming. For some, this marriage painted him as a calculating social climber. This is a man who marries the daughter of a senator, one who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee and is an acquaintance, if not a friend, of Teddy Roosevelt. Such connections undoubtedly benefited him. Just a year after Pershing's wedding, President Theodore Roosevelt made a remarkable decision by promoting the 46-year-old Pershing from captain to brigadier general, bypassing the seniority of hundreds of other officers. This action effectively isolated Pershing within the American officer corps, as he was elevated above more than 800 other officers, all of whom harbored some resentment over being overlooked. Pershing dismissed allegations of political favoritism as he continued to advance in his career. He and Helen commenced their life together, but inquiries regarding Pershing's reasons for marrying Helen Warren were tragically silenced on August 27, 1915, when a fire broke out at the Presidio military base in San Francisco. The blaze consumed the Pershing residence, resulting in the deaths of Helen and 3 of their 4 children. At that time, Pershing was stationed in Texas and was profoundly affected by this loss, leaving him shattered by the experience. For a period, his fellow officers feared that he might lose his sanity. While it is a tragic way to demonstrate love, this incident indeed reflects the deep affection that existed between him and Helen. It significantly altered his life in 2 notable ways. Firstly, he became increasingly withdrawn from the outside world. Although he had always been quite austere, this tragedy intensified that aspect of his personality. Secondly, he dedicated himself entirely to his work. Following the events of 1915, he seemed to conclude that his only remaining purpose was his position as an officer in the United States Army. By the time he reached Europe during World War I, he was fully engaged in his role as a commanding officer. Despite facing strong Allied pressure to relinquish troops, he focused on establishing an independent American army. Pershing anticipated that over 2 million soldiers would arrive in Europe in the coming year. Before these new recruits could be integrated, he needed to develop a structure capable of supporting them. He reorganized his staff of officers to more effectively tackle the immense logistical challenges ahead. When the American Army entered World War I, the battle organization relied heavily on the commanding general, a method that had proven disastrous in terms of logistics during the Spanish-American War. Determined to avoid past mistakes, Pershing insisted on having a dedicated staff of officers responsible for planning and organizing not only the campaigns and battles, but also all logistical aspects, including supplies, food, and ammunition. It was an immense undertaking, yet Pershing was fortunate to have gathered a team of exceptionally skilled young officers to assist him in accomplishing the task. Among his team were future military leaders such as George Patton, Douglas MacArthur, and George Marshall. This aspect significantly contributes to the legend of John Pershing, as he played a crucial role in nurturing some of America's most distinguished commanders, keeping them close and relying heavily on their expertise. At their headquarters located in a chateau near Paris, Pershing and his staff dedicated themselves to their work. They established training schools where soldiers were educated on the new technologies employed in ground and aerial combat. Additionally, they developed a comprehensive supply chain involving horses, trucks, and trains to ensure a steady flow of food, clothing, and ammunition to the front lines. They installed over 22,000 miles of telephone wire to facilitate communication between headquarters and units stationed far away. Their primary objective was to ensure that the soldiers engaged in combat received all necessary support. Pershing demanded that all operations adhere to the highest standards. He was resolute in his expectation of performance, and if his standards were not met, he was prepared to make swift changes. During World War I, he demonstrated his exceptional management skills. He established a robust organization, selected competent individuals to lead it, and had effective planners on his staff. This was his significant contribution. While it may not seem particularly glamorous, being recognized as a great manager, Americans often admire generals like George Patton, known for their daring and bold actions. However, there is an old military adage: amateurs focus on strategy and tactics, while professionals concentrate on logistics. In the conflict Pershing was engaged in, as well as in the wars America faced throughout the 20th century, organization and management proved to be as vital as battlefield tactics. Yet in 1917, the extensive organizing process was consuming valuable time. Time that Pershing's anxious allies increasingly felt was in short supply. 6 months after the United States entered the conflict, not a single American division was engaged in active combat. Each day that American forces remained inactive was another day that French soldiers were fighting and losing their lives. This situation was not conducive to fostering a positive relationship between the Allies. By November, tensions had escalated further. Russia, an ally of France and Britain on the Eastern Front, negotiated a truce with Germany and withdrew from the war. This development created a sense of urgency among the commanders on the Western Front, as they were acutely aware that the German troops previously engaged in Russia would soon return to the Western Front. The Americans needed to be prepared to confront these forces, as the British and French doubted their ability to manage the situation. These concerns materialized in the spring of 1918. Starting in March, the Germans initiated 5 consecutive offensives that posed a significant threat to the Allies. They utilized the reinforcements from Russia to launch a substantial attack against both the French and British, achieving a breakthrough that at one point suggested Paris could fall. General Haig, the commander of British forces, sent a telegram instructing his troops that retreat was not an option. He emphasized that they must hold their positions, regardless of the circumstances. Against this backdrop, the British and French began to insist on the need for American troops to bolster their efforts. In response to the escalating crisis, Pershing made concessions regarding the integration of forces, but he did so on his own terms. U.S. troops could operate under European command, but only within distinct American divisions and for a limited duration. In a critical situation, Pershing was prepared to allow American forces to serve under non-American commanders at the highest levels. He seeks to regain those forces. American divisions were deployed to the front lines, successfully obstructing the route to Paris and repelling the German advance. This achievement represents more of a psychological and emotional triumph than a complete tactical victory. Nevertheless, the involvement of American troops in the conflict has become undeniable to the Allies. The success of the American forces enhanced Pershing's credibility among his European counterparts, leading them to finally endorse the establishment of an independent American army. Throughout the summer of 1918, American divisions that had been dispersed among Allied units were consolidated. Their initial mission as a unified American army was to assault a German stronghold near the town of Saint-Michel, which had been entrenched for 4 years. The Germans had breached the Allied defenses there, creating a heavily fortified bulge in the front lines. The French lacked the necessary strength to eliminate this bulge, prompting the Americans to view it as an opportunity to prove themselves. If the Americans could successfully remove the bulge, it would pave the way for further assaults on German supply lines and critical coal and iron mines. On September 12, 1918, over a year after their arrival in Europe, Pershing led the first American army into combat. He addressed the nation regarding the significant contributions this army would make. 3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you value is at stake. Calling upon the spirit of our ancestors, the Army requests your unwavering support to ensure that the noble ideals for which America stands may endure. Pershing is resolute that the Americans will perform admirably, and he orders them to charge against the salient. The result is a decisive victory for the Americans, as they successfully drive the Germans back. They surpassed their initial goal for the first day within just a few hours of the attack, exceeding their expectations. Pershing viewed this achievement as validation not only for his concept of a unified American army, but also for the broader American strategy and tactics. He advocated for open warfare rather than trench warfare, demonstrating to the old world that their methods were flawed and that Americans could execute military operations more effectively. Pershing was thrilled with the success at San Miguel. In merely 2 days, his forces captured 16,000 prisoners and reclaimed 200 square miles of territory. However, there was more to the situation than Pershing understood. It became evident that the Germans were already in retreat when the American forces launched their attack, meaning the Americans were engaging a withdrawing army. The true challenge for the American army would arise 2 weeks later, in October 1918, in the Meuse-Argonne region. Here, Pershing's troops would be tasked with a critical role in a campaign aimed at decisively expelling the Germans from France. This time, the Americans would face a much tougher battle. At Meuse-Argonne, the Germans were prepared to defend their positions. For the first time, American soldiers encountered the realities of trench warfare, facing a well-organized German force equipped with machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery. Over the following weeks, tens of thousands of American soldiers would lose their lives. Signs of strain began to emerge, revealing cracks in the system as issues arose at the planning and logistics levels, while transitioning from the San Miguel offensive to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. As you endeavor to maintain the new offensive, it unexpectedly transforms into a daunting challenge. The newly formed American army was finally facing the dire conditions that had long afflicted the Allies. Despite Pershing's assertions regarding open warfare and the capabilities of an independent American army, his troops were struggling to achieve their objectives on the battlefield. Pershing believed he could improve the situation, but in reality, his performance was likely comparable to that of his predecessors. He faced criticism from other Allied commanders regarding the Meuse-Argonne campaign, who felt a sense of satisfaction in witnessing him confront the challenges they had endured for 3 years. Nevertheless, in the face of mounting criticism and increasing casualties, Pershing remained resolute. His role was characterized by determination. When faced with adversity, he insisted on continuing the fight. While his tactical contributions may not have been significant, his leadership and inspirational presence were vital. Often we refer to Gettysburg as the greatest battle due to its three-day duration and scale. However, the Meuse-Argonne was actually a larger engagement than any that preceded or followed it, surpassing even D-Day, with 1 million Americans participating. This was Pershing's battle, where those 1 million soldiers endured 7 arduous weeks in the Meuse-Argonne before ultimately achieving a breakthrough. Their efforts, combined with those of the Allies in nearby campaigns, ultimately overwhelmed the German forces. On November 11, 1918, marking the 47th day of the Meuse-Argonne, the Germans consented to an armistice. In recognition of his role in this victory, Pershing led a victorious procession through the streets of Paris and was celebrated as a hero upon his return to America. Following World War I, the American public predominantly recognized one name: Pershing. It was a significant victory, and he was hailed as a great hero. However, the extent of Pershing's actual contribution to the war's outcome has been a topic of debate for many years. The contributions of Pershing and the American forces to the victory in the war are significant, though not the sole determining factor. There is a common perception that the Americans arrived and single-handedly secured victory. In reality, the war was primarily won by the British and French armies, with American support playing a crucial role. It is my belief that the Allies would not have achieved victory had the Americans not participated. The most favorable outcome without them would likely have been a stalemate or even a potential loss. Without American involvement, it is unclear how the British and French would have managed to halt the German advance. The decisive factor was not necessarily American combat skills, tactics, or strategies, but rather the logistical capability to deploy 2 million troops to the front lines in a relatively short time frame, which was instrumental in securing victory. Following the war, Pershing's force was significantly reduced. The United States then entered a phase of isolationism, and by 1932, the U.S. Army was ranked 17th globally. Despite the rapid disbandment of the American forces after World War I, Pershing's influence on the military was lasting. He established a framework for an American army that could be rapidly expanded when necessary, built upon a core group of officers and soldiers skilled in organizing and managing such a force. This structure has endured and would be reactivated nearly 2 decades later during World War II. The young men he trained during the First World War, who later rose to prominence as high-ranking officers such as George Marshall and George Patton, utilized their experiences to help secure victory against the Nazis and the Japanese. General John J. Pershing passed away on July 15, 1948, at the age of 87. Years after his leadership during World War I, the nation he served continued to honor him. Pershing was celebrated with a grand ceremony attended by numerous 5-star generals. They all recognized the significant impact he had on the American military, particularly as his World War I forces laid the groundwork for the army that would fight in World War II. This was an army equipped with modern staff and had engaged in unprecedented large-scale combat. His remarkable achievement was the establishment and preservation of this formidable organization, demonstrating his strong character and unwavering determination. Thank you for watching.